April 7th, 2026, 5:47 in the morning. The airfield near Saki, Crimea, was still dark. Three Su-24 strike aircraft sat inside hardened concrete shelters, engines cold, fuel lines connected, weapons loaded. In 11 minutes, the first sortie would begin. The crews were awake. Ground technicians ran pre-flight checks. Russian air defense radar operators watched their scopes. The S-400 battery, positioned 3 kilometers north of the runway, was fully operational, its tracking radar sweeping the horizon in a slow arc. Russian commanders had spent months fortifying this position. After earlier strikes forced a repositioning of Crimea-based strike aircraft, they moved the Su-24s further inland, further from the coast, deeper into what they believed was a protected envelope. Upgraded camouflage netting covered the aircraft shelters. Additional S-400 coverage had been layered over the approach corridors from the north, east, and northeast. The runway had been resurfaced. The fuel infrastructure had been buried and reinforced. This base, in the assessment of Russia's 4th Air and Air Defense Army, was untouchable. The assessment was wrong. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What happened over Crimea on the morning of April 7th, 2026, was not just another strike, not just another weapon system hitting another target. It was the product of months of patient, methodical intelligence work, a targeting solution so precise that Ukrainian planners didn't just know where the aircraft were. They knew exactly when those aircraft would be on the ground, fueled and armed, in the most concentrated and vulnerable window of the entire operational day. Stay with me. Over the next 18 minutes, we're going to take apart every layer of what made this strike different. The weapon, the flight profile, the radar gap, the intelligence source that no one has officially confirmed, and the moment, 6 hours after impact, when satellite imagery was released and the world saw what 3 Storm Shadow cruise missiles can do when they arrive exactly on schedule. This is War Vector. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. To understand April 7th, you have to understand what the Su-24 means in this war. The Sukhoi Su-24 is a Soviet-designed variable sweep wing strike aircraft. NATO calls it Fencer. First flown in 1970, it was built for one purpose: low altitude, high-speed penetration of defended airspace to deliver conventional or nuclear ordnance against ground targets. Russia operates several variants, but the ones stationed in Crimea were primarily Su-24M models, the modernized version with improved targeting systems and extended range. Each aircraft carries a maximum weapons load of approximately 8,000 kilograms. Each, when operational, is capable of delivering precision-guided munitions at ranges that place large portions of southern Ukraine within striking distance. Russia had been using Crimea-based Su-24s for strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure since early in the war. Power stations, rail junctions, civilian water treatment facilities. The aircraft would take off, fly low, launch their ordnance, and return to base before Ukrainian air defenses could fully respond. It was a pattern, a rhythm, and rhythm in warfare creates predictability. Ukrainian intelligence had been watching that rhythm for months. The problem, heading into late 2025 and early 2026, was that Russia had adapted. The repositioning of the Su-24 fleet to the hardened secondary base near Saki was a deliberate response to the increasing accuracy of Ukrainian long-range strikes. Russian planners assessed the coastal bases as too exposed. Moving deeper into Crimea bought distance. The new base sat approximately 22 kilometers from the nearest coastline. S-400 coverage overhead was dense, and the hardened aircraft shelters, thick, reinforced concrete structures designed to survive near-miss detonations, made the aircraft far more difficult to reach. Which weapon was more decisive in Ukrainian long-range strike operations against Crimea-based targets? A. Storm Shadow cruise missiles. B. Neptune anti-ship missiles. Or C. Naval drone strikes. Drop your answer in the comments. We'll come back to this. Ukrainian strike planners faced a layered problem. First, range. The base near Saki required a delivery system capable of striking deep into Crimea from a launch point that kept the delivery aircraft outside Russian air defense coverage. Second, radar. The S-400 battery at the base had overlapping coverage with a second battery positioned further south, creating an interlocking network that could engage targets approaching from most directions. Third, hardening. The aircraft shelters were designed to withstand significant blast overpressure, meaning a near miss was simply a miss. Only a direct hit on or adjacent to a shelter entrance, or a penetrating strike against the structure itself, would produce meaningful damage. None of these problems, individually, was unsolvable. Storm Shadow had hit Crimean targets before. The weapon's 250-kilometer range, combined with its terrain-following flight profile, had already demonstrated the ability to defeat standard air defense coverage. The challenge was solving all three problems at once, and solving them precisely enough that the missiles arrived when the aircraft were present, not after they had taken off or before they were loaded. That last variable, timing, is what most conventional strike planning treats as secondary. You identify the target, plan the approach, execute the strike. Whether the target is occupied at the moment of impact is a matter of probability, not precision. On April 7th, Ukrainian strike planners turned probability into certainty. I spent time going through the available open-source documentation on this strike, satellite imagery analyses, OSINT investigations, Ukrainian General Staff statements, and fragmentary Russian communications that were intercepted and later circulated. One detail kept coming back. In every account, from every source, the timing of the strike relative to the Su-24 sortie schedule is described as though it were coincidental, 11 minutes before the first scheduled departure. The way it's written makes it sound like luck. It wasn't luck. The obstacle Ukrainian intelligence faced was not identifying the base. The base was already known. Satellite imagery had confirmed the repositioning of the Su-24 fleet months earlier. The obstacle was penetrating the operational security surrounding the sortie schedule. Russian air regiments don't publish their flight plans. Crew briefings happen inside secured facilities. Fuel and weapons loading begins hours before departure and follows a sequence that, to an outside observer, looks largely the same, regardless of when the actual sortie is scheduled. For 3 months, Ukrainian intelligence units, working in coordination with signals intelligence collection, and, according to several reports, a human intelligence network operating inside occupied Crimea, tracked every observable indicator of operational tempo at the Saki secondary base. Fuel truck movements, generator activity, the timing of ground crew arrivals, the pattern of radar emissions from the base's own approach control systems. 3 months of observation. The signal eventually emerged from the noise. The sortie scheduling at the base followed a consistent pattern tied to the operational tasking cycle of the 4th Air and Air Defense Army. Morning departures, when they occurred, clustered in a window beginning at approximately 5:58 in the morning. The pre-flight sequence, fuel up, weapons check, crew brief, engine start, required approximately 90 minutes, which meant that if an aircraft was scheduled to depart at 5:58, it was fully fueled, fully armed, and sitting inside its shelter with the crew present at approximately 4:45 to 5 o'clock in the morning. The ideal strike window was 5:30 to 5:55. Maximum aircraft presence, minimum likelihood of an early abort that would have cleared the shelters. Storm Shadow missiles launched from Ukrainian airspace at the correct time, flying the correct approach profile, would reach the target at approximately 5:47. The planning was done. The intelligence picture was as complete as it was going to get. What remained was getting the missiles through. Stay with me, because what happens next is where the tactical sophistication of Ukrainian strike planning becomes genuinely interesting. The S-400 coverage over the Saki base was not uniform. No air defense network is. The physics of radar mean every battery has coverage gaps, areas where terrain masking, antenna orientation, or overlapping system geometries create zones where an incoming target at the right altitude is invisible or detectable only at ranges too short for an effective intercept. Ukrainian strike planners had been mapping the S-400 coverage over Crimea for months using radar emission analysis, known battery positions from satellite imagery, and modeling of the S-400's detection parameters against low-altitude targets. The picture that emerged was not a uniform defensive umbrella. It was a patchwork with seams. The seam that mattered for the April 7th strike was to the southwest. The S-400 battery positioned north of the Saki base had its primary coverage oriented toward the west and northwest, the most likely approach direction for strikes originating from Ukrainian-controlled territory. A second battery further south covered the eastern and southeastern approaches. Between these two coverage zones, to the southwest, over open water, there was a gap, not a complete blind spot, but a zone where detection range against a low-altitude target was significantly reduced, and where any contact would appear at ranges too short for a comfortable intercept solution. The gap existed because repositioning either battery to cover it would have uncovered other approach sectors. Russian air defense commanders knew about it. Their response was procedural. Standing orders required Su-24 sortie times to be varied to prevent pattern analysis, and ground radar units were instructed to increase scan rates during the pre-dawn window. Neither measure was implemented consistently. The sortie schedule had become predictable. The radar scan rates had relaxed as weeks passed without incident. Here is the uncomfortable truth about what happened at Saki on April 7th. It was not a failure of hardware. Russia had sufficient air defense equipment in Crimea to protect that base. The failure was institutional. Russian military culture, with its emphasis on hierarchical authority and procedural compliance, is structurally poor at maintaining discipline in defensive procedures over extended periods when nothing happens. The S-400 operators who were supposed to be increasing scan rates weren't failing because their equipment was inadequate. They were failing because nobody checked, nobody enforced, and nobody believed the threat would come from that direction at that moment. Ukraine exploited exactly that assumption. The delivery platform for the Storm Shadow missiles on April 7th has not been officially identified. Ukrainian authorities have been deliberately opaque about the modification of their aircraft to carry British-supplied cruise missiles, for obvious reasons of operational security. What is known from visual evidence of previous strikes and from confirmed deliveries is that Ukraine has operated Storm Shadow missiles since 2023, and that the delivery aircraft flies a profile designed to minimize radar exposure during the approach to the launch point. For the April 7th strike, Ukrainian strike planners selected an approach route that used the curvature of the Black Sea horizon as cover. The delivery aircraft flew a nap-of-the-earth profile at altitudes low enough to remain below the radar horizon of the coastal detection systems Russia had positioned along the Crimean shoreline. This was not a simple routing decision. Low-altitude flight over open water at night, without terrain features to reference, with the aircraft under radio silence and without active radar, is genuinely demanding. The crew flying that mission was not taking a routine trip. The aircraft would have crossed the Black Sea at low altitude, flown a specific approach arc to the southwest of the Saki base, climbed briefly to the minimum altitude required for Storm Shadow release. The missile requires a brief climb to acquire its navigation lock before entering its own terrain-following descent, and released its weapons within the release envelope before turning back toward Ukrainian airspace. From the moment the missiles separated from the aircraft, they were on their own. The Storm Shadow, known in its French variant as Scalp-EG, is a conventionally armed, air-launched cruise missile with a range of approximately 250 kilometers. It flies at low altitude using terrain-following guidance, navigating by GPS and an inertial navigation system with terrain contour matching for precision updates during the flight. Its warhead is a broach tandem-shaped charge, specifically designed to defeat reinforced concrete structures. The first charge blasts a hole. The main warhead penetrates and detonates inside. Against a hardened aircraft shelter, that penetration capability is the difference between a cosmetic crater and structural destruction. Put yourself in the position of the Ukrainian targeting officer responsible for this strike. You have 3 missiles. You have 3 shelters, each potentially containing an Su-24. You have a fuel manifold that, if destroyed, will take weeks to repair even if the aircraft themselves survive. And you have to make a decision about target priority with intelligence that is, by its nature, incomplete. Did you make the right calls? Comment below. The allocation of those 3 warheads is one of the most interesting tactical decisions in this entire operation. The targeting solution allocated the 3 Storm Shadow missiles as follows. The first 2 were assigned to the 2 hardened shelters, assessed as most likely to contain operational aircraft, based on pre-dawn activity indicators observed in the hours before the strike. The third missile was assigned to the fuel manifold, the central fuel distribution point connecting underground fuel storage to the aircraft servicing lines. The rationale for the third target was layered. Even if the first 2 missiles failed to achieve direct penetrating hits on the shelters, destroying the fuel manifold would immediately neutralize the operational readiness of the entire base. Aircraft don't fly without fuel. Repair of a destroyed manifold with its buried lines and pressurized infrastructure would require weeks. The third missile wasn't a consolation prize for missing the shelters. It was a force multiplier, regardless of what the first 2 achieved. At 5:47 in the morning, all 3 missiles impacted within a window of approximately 14 seconds. The first missile hit the entrance of shelter number 2, one of the 2 assessed as containing an operational Su-24, at an oblique angle that drove the broach warhead through the concrete facing before detonation. Structural analysis from satellite imagery released 36 hours later showed the shelter's roof had partially collapsed. The aircraft inside, an Su-24M, was destroyed by blast and fire. At least one member of the ground crew was inside the shelter at the time of the strike. Russian casualty acknowledgments were, as expected, minimal and deliberately vague. The second missile impacted shelter number 4, the other priority target. This hit was more direct. The warhead struck the shelter's blast door, which had not been fully closed, and penetrated into the interior before detonation. The blast ignited the shelter's internal fuel and weapons load. The Su-24 inside, which had been fully fueled for its 5:58 sortie, became a secondary explosion source almost immediately. The fire burned inside the sealed shelter for several hours before structural heat caused a partial wall collapse. The third missile hit the fuel manifold. The fireball from the manifold strike was visible from the Saki town center, approximately 4 kilometers from the base perimeter. Residents reported a sound described in multiple accounts as a continuous low roar rather than a single explosion. The sound of a pressurized aviation fuel distribution system decompressing and igniting all at once. The fire burned for 6 hours. Ukrainian General Staff imagery, released the following afternoon, showed the manifold site as a crater approximately 8 meters deep and 20 meters across, surrounded by scorched earth extending 40 meters in all directions. A third, Su-24, was destroyed not by direct missile impact, but by secondary fire from the manifold. This aircraft had been positioned outside the shelters on the taxiway apron. Satellite imagery from 2 days before the strike had shown it there, apparently undergoing maintenance that prevented it from being moved inside. The fire spread from the manifold along a fuel service line to the apron, reaching the aircraft approximately 12 minutes after the initial impact. By the time Russian firefighting teams arrived, the aircraft was burning from the inside out. How many Su-24 airframes did Ukraine destroy or render unserviceable in this single strike? A. 2, B. 3, C. 4. We'll answer that at the end. The full damage assessment, reconstructed from satellite imagery analysis, Ukrainian General Staff releases, and independent OSINT verification. 2 hardened aircraft shelters destroyed or critically damaged. 1 Su-24 destroyed inside its shelter by the first missile. 1 Su-24 destroyed inside its shelter by the second missile and resulting fire. 1 Su-24 destroyed on the taxiway apron by secondary fire from the manifold strike. The fuel manifold completely destroyed, along with approximately 340 meters of the fuel distribution network's surface infrastructure. The runway approach lighting system, struck by debris from the manifold explosion, completely non-functional. Total value of equipment destroyed in this single 14-second window. Ukrainian defense analysts estimated the figure at between 85 and 110 million US dollars, accounting for aircraft, fuel infrastructure, and associated support equipment. Russia's official response was silence. No acknowledgement of the strike was issued by the Ministry of Defense on April 7th or 8th. The standard playbook, deny, minimize, attribute to Ukrainian propaganda, was initiated, but could not survive the satellite imagery that emerged 36 hours after the strike. Here's what's most surprising about the Russian response to April 7th, and I mean this in a structural, institutional sense. It's not that Russian command denied the damage. Denial is expected. What's surprising is how fast the evacuation decision came. Within 72 hours of the strike, by the morning of April 10th, satellite imagery showed the remaining Crimea-based Su-24 aircraft being relocated, not to a different Crimean base. Out of Crimea entirely. The aircraft dispersed to bases on the Russian mainland, further from Ukrainian strike range. at a distance that significantly degraded their operational utility for strikes against southern Ukrainian targets. That decision was made at a command level above the local air regiment. It was a strategic withdrawal driven by a single strike against a base Russian commanders had explicitly assessed as protected. The evacuation happened so fast it caught some OSINT analysts by surprise. The movement was detected not through advanced intelligence but through the satellite pass that captured aircraft departing that would not have been expected to be mobile so soon after the strike. What this tells us at War Vector is something important about the psychological dimension of precision strike operations. The physical damage from April 7th was significant, but not irreplaceable. Russia can rebuild a fuel manifold. Russia can repair or replace concrete shelters, given sufficient time and resources. What Russia cannot easily repair is the command confidence that comes from believing a position is secure. 3 Su-24s destroyed in 14 seconds at a base designed specifically to be untouchable forced a fundamental reassessment of what secure meant anywhere in Crimea. The evacuation wasn't just logistics, it was an admission. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because this is what it looks like when one side turns intelligence into precision and precision into strategic consequence. The story of April 7th doesn't end with the evacuation. It opens a set of questions that Ukrainian strike planners, Western defense analysts, and Russian military theorists are still working through. The intelligence source that produced the sortie schedule has never been officially confirmed. Ukrainian military intelligence has declined to specify whether the information came from signals collection, from a human source inside the base or its command chain, from a cyber operation against Russian communications infrastructure, or from some combination of all three. The answer matters because the method of collection determines how replicable this kind of operation is. If the schedule was obtained through signals intelligence, intercepted radio, or encrypted communications, then it suggests Ukrainian collection capabilities against Russian tactical communications are sophisticated enough to harvest operationally sensitive scheduling data. That has implications far beyond a single airbase strike. If the schedule was obtained through human intelligence, a source inside the base, a sympathizer in Crimea with access to the operational tasking chain, then it raises different questions about the depth of Ukrainian intelligence penetration into Russian-occupied territory, and about what else such a network might know. The most uncomfortable interpretation for Russian commanders is that both are true. That the intelligence picture Ukrainian planners worked from was assembled from multiple streams, all pointing to the same target, the same window, the same vulnerability. There is a detail in the available open-source record that I keep returning to. Ukrainian strike planners timed the impact for 5:47, 11 minutes before the scheduled sortie. Not 10 minutes, not 15, 11. The precision of that margin suggests the targeting team had a high degree of confidence in the 5:58 departure time and had calculated backwards to arrive at the impact window that maximized both aircraft presence and crew presence on the ground. 11 minutes gave no margin for error on their side, but it also gave no margin for escape on the Russian side. That kind of precision is not the product of a single intelligence report. It's the product of a mature, multi-source intelligence apparatus with enough confidence in its own picture to schedule a strike within minutes of a moving target. There was a critical obstacle that almost prevented the strike from executing on schedule. In the 72 hours before April 7th, Russian electronic warfare systems based in northern Crimea conducted what OSINT analysts described as unusually intensive GPS jamming operations over the Black Sea approaches. The jamming was broad-spectrum and persistent, likely a response to intelligence suggesting increased Ukrainian strike activity was being planned. It wasn't targeted at any specific system or approach corridor. It was background interference designed to degrade the navigation accuracy of any cruise missile or drone transiting the affected zone. Storm Shadow is designed to operate in GPS-denied environments. Its terrain contour matching navigation, TERPROM, uses a digital elevation map stored in the missile's own computer and correlates it against radar altimeter readings to maintain positional accuracy, independent of GPS. Against GPS jamming, a well-programmed Storm Shadow can maintain circular error probable accuracy of approximately 3 meters. But the jamming added a layer of uncertainty to the pre-strike planning, requiring Ukrainian targeting teams to recompute the missile's navigation updates for the final approach leg using terrain contour data from the flat, featureless terrain of the Crimean lowlands. Flat terrain is the enemy of TERPROM navigation. Without elevation changes to match, the system relies more heavily on its GPS component. Ukrainian targeting staff had to find a route that gave the missiles at least one significant terrain feature to match against during the final approach, a task that required an additional planning cycle and delayed strike authorization by approximately 18 hours. The strike that hit at 5:47 on April 7th was originally scheduled for the morning of April 6th. The terrain navigation problem pushed it a full day. That detail, as far as I can tell, has never appeared in any major media account of this strike. It matters because it demonstrates something easy to miss in the narrative of Ukrainian tactical success. These operations are hard. They require solving problems that are not obvious and not simple, under time pressure, with incomplete information, and with no margin for error on execution. If you believe tactics win wars, type war vector in the comments. Real tactics, real consequences, war vector. The broader lessons of April 7th operate at different levels of analysis. At the tactical level, the strike demonstrated that hardened aircraft shelters provide significant but not absolute protection. The Broach warhead on the Storm Shadow was specifically engineered to defeat reinforced concrete, and it performed as designed. Russian decisions to invest in shelter hardening at the Saki secondary base were rational, but the investment did not outpace the penetrating capability of the available Ukrainian strike system. This is a fundamental lesson of modern precision strike. Hardening that is not coupled with effective air defense is eventually insufficient. At the operational level, the strike revealed a critical vulnerability in the Russian approach to air-based defense in occupied Crimea. The S-400 network was coverage-dense but coverage-rigid. The gap to the southwest was a known weakness, but fixing it required repositioning batteries in ways that created other gaps. This is the classic dilemma of air defense network design. You cannot cover everywhere, and a sophisticated adversary will find and exploit the seam. Ukrainian targeting demonstrated exactly that capability. The missile flew approximately 180 kilometers from its release point to the target, at altitudes estimated between 40 and 90 meters above sea level for most of the approach profile, before climbing to deliver its terminal attack. The Russian radar network detected the inbound missiles. Detection, in this case, was not the same as interdiction. The geometry of the approach gave the S-400 battery approximately 45 to 60 seconds of engagement window. Not enough time, in practice, to execute a full fire control solution against a low-altitude, fast-maneuvering target with the radar tracking arc available. At the strategic level, the most significant outcome was not the aircraft destroyed or the fuel manifold cratered. It was the evacuation. Russia's decision to remove its remaining Crimea-based Su-24s from the peninsula within 72 hours was a strategic concession. Those aircraft had been used to strike Ukrainian targets across a broad region of southern Ukraine. Relocating them to mainland bases increased their round-trip range requirements, reduced available fuel and weapons loads for missions into Ukraine, and significantly complicated the logistical chain for maintenance and arming. The operational tempo of Russian strike missions against southern Ukrainian targets from Crimea-based aircraft dropped measurably in the weeks following April 7th. That drop in tempo had direct consequences for the soldiers on the front lines those aircraft had been supporting. The thing about this strike that doesn't sit right, even now, is the sortie schedule. We know Ukraine had it. We know the strike was timed to it with 11 minutes of margin. We don't know how they got it. And in a war where operational security failures have decided battles, the fact that a Russian air regiment's departure schedule for a hardened secondary base in occupied Crimea was in Ukrainian hands before the aircraft even completed pre-flight. That should be the most discussed aspect of this entire operation. It isn't. Most coverage focuses on the missiles, the shelters, the explosions. The intelligence story gets a paragraph, if that. Here's the question that should drive comment discussion. Team Signals Intelligence or Team Human Source? Where was the leak in Russia's operational security chain? Comment below with your analysis. We read every response, and this is one where the community has genuinely insightful takes worth sharing. What would NATO have done differently with the same intelligence picture? Drop your operational analysis in the comments. Some of the best tactical thinking we see on this channel comes from those threads. What comes next in the tactical evolution of this campaign matters for understanding where the war is heading. The April 7th strike was not an isolated event. It was part of a sustained Ukrainian effort to degrade Russian aviation in the Black Sea theater, to progressively reduce the ability of Russian forces to use air power against Ukrainian positions and infrastructure. The naval drone campaign that had already substantially constrained Russia's Black Sea fleet demonstrated a principle that the Saki strike applied to a new domain. You do not need traditional military superiority to achieve strategic effect. You need intelligence, precision, patience, and the willingness to execute a difficult operation correctly. Ukraine had all of that on April 7th. Russian commanders in the aftermath faced a decision set with no good options. Keeping the Su-24s in Crimea meant accepting that they could be struck again, possibly with better coverage of the Southwest Gap if Russia repositioned its S-400 network. Moving them to the mainland preserved the aircraft but reduced their operational utility. In the end, they moved them. And in moving them, they ceded a capability that had been part of their strike architecture against southern Ukraine. That concession was not forced by a Ukrainian army that outnumbered Russian forces. It was not the product of a NATO member state deploying its own aircraft. It was the product of a Ukrainian targeting team, working from intelligence that took months to develop, executing a 3-missile strike at 5:47 in the morning, with 14 seconds of impact separation and 11 minutes of operational margin. It was, in the most precise sense of the phrase, a scheduling problem, and Ukraine solved it. Now, the answer to the quiz. How many Su-24 airframes did Ukraine destroy in this strike? The correct answer is B, 3 aircraft. 2 were destroyed inside their hardened shelters by direct storm shadow hits. The third was destroyed on the taxiway apron by secondary fire spreading from the fuel manifold strike, approximately 12 minutes after the initial impacts. A fourth aircraft was reportedly damaged by blast effects and debris, but repairable. Ukrainian sources classify this as unserviceable, but not destroyed, and Russian sources have not addressed the question at all. The total of 3 confirmed destroyed airframes is supported by satellite imagery analysis from multiple independent OSINT groups, cross-referenced against the pre-strike baseline satellite imagery that had cataloged the aircraft at the base. 3 lessons define April 7th. First, timing is a weapon. Ukrainian intelligence turned a sortie schedule into a targeting solution, converting the enemy's operational routine into a vulnerability. Every military force that operates on predictable rhythms is offering that vulnerability to any adversary sophisticated enough to find it. Second, coverage gaps are not theoretical problems. The southwest gap in the S-400 network over the Saki base was known. It was accepted because fixing it created other problems. On April 7th, Ukraine flew through it. Air defense networks must be designed and maintained with the assumption that adversaries are mapping the seams. Third, evacuation is a strategic concession. Russia moved its Crimea-based Su-24s within 72 hours of the strike. That decision acknowledged that the protective architecture of the secondary base had failed, and that the risk of continued presence outweighed the operational benefit of staying. 3 Storm Shadow missiles, costing approximately $3 million each, forced a strategic repositioning of an aviation capability that had been a consistent source of Russian strike capacity against southern Ukraine. The cost-exchange calculus of that outcome is unambiguous. Was the target prioritization correct, allocating one of 3 missiles to the fuel manifold rather than a third shelter? Would Russia have evacuated faster or slower if the damage had been confined to aircraft rather than infrastructure? And what would you have done differently, sitting at that targeting table at 2 in the morning, with 3 missiles and 5 potential targets? Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The airfield near Saki is quiet now. The shelters that were hit have not been rebuilt. The fuel manifold crater is still visible in the most recent satellite imagery. The Su-24s are gone, relocated to bases that require longer flight profiles to reach Ukrainian targets, burning more fuel, carrying lighter weapons loads, operating at reduced effectiveness. All of it a reminder that modern warfare punishes tactical complacency without mercy. That intelligence is not a support function. It is a weapon system in its own right. And that 3 missiles, delivered on schedule, can change a theater. Stay vigilant.